We're in a series which we started last week called Scary Bible Stories. And we looked at the story of Adam and Eve last week. I mean, I don't know whether it was really all that scary. Today's story maybe is a little bit more scary. It's the story of Noah and the ark, or the flood. And in this series, we're looking at some of the tricky stories in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. Some of the stories that we often tell our kids, that stories that very frequently appear in children's versions of the Bible, that if you dig into them a little bit, perhaps a little more sinister, a little more macabre, a little more scary than they would seem like on the surface. And I think today's story, Noah and the Ark, is a great example of that. It's a story in one sense. We have sort of very childlike images of this story. So there's a picture of the rainbow and the ark and all the animals that were saved and Noah's family. And that's a kind of iconic image, I think, not just in churches, but in culture in general, right? I used to work in hospitals and go into a children's department in a lot of hospitals in England even, which is a very secular country, and you'll see pictures of Noah's Ark. And it's sort of got this lovely, wholesome kind of feel to it, happy, etc. It perhaps is, telling the last part of the story. The actual story itself is about the destruction of the world and everybody drowned, right? So it's not really necessarily a kid's story. You can actually see it if you look at the detail here. That's a jigsaw puzzle, right? So it's we have children's games about a story where everybody on the planet, apart from one chosen person or one chosen family, was drowned. So underneath this story is another sort of more sinister or more difficult aspect. And we've got I think this next slide illustrates this. My favorite part of the Bible is when God gives people free will and then kills everyone with a flood for not acting the way he wanted, right? So that's the other side of this story. One is a very optimistic, hopeful, positive. Isn't it great? I mean, and there is something beautiful about the story, the ark, the rainbow, etc. But then underlying it is this, hang on a minute. What does this really say about God? And that is perhaps the scary part. Another scary part, I mean, for me and maybe for others is, okay, really, did every single animal on the planet get on that boat? I mean, so there's some difficult to believe, let's say, aspects to the story as well, which kind of might make it a bit scary for religious people, because we might, can we believe the Bible? Can we trust the Bible? That kind of thing. Okay, so it's scary for a number of reasons. Now, we talked a little bit last week about how we need to wrestle with these stories, struggle with these stories, because if we bring our own modern sensibilities to these stories and our own modern understanding of life, the universe, and everything, we might impose those on the story, on the text, and then we're left with some struggles. We either then have to sort of make that story fit, and we start with our modern understanding, and we try to sort of take it literally and make it all work out for us. And we might actually then be misinterpreting the story. We might be, if we're going to take the Bible seriously, we've got to look at what did it really mean to the people who were writing it, to the people who were reading it in the ancient world. And secondly, another reaction might be we might impose our modern sensibilities on it and say, well, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make sense. That can't happen. And then we dismiss it like it's a load of rubbish. And we might miss the fact that there's some incredible truth and meaning and ancient wisdom in this text that can really help us and benefit us. And we just dismiss it because it doesn't make sense based on our understanding, our modern sensibilities about how to read literature, how to read stories, how to understand reality, right? So we've got to be careful with it. We've got to struggle with it. And I think last week, just talking with some folks afterwards and since, I think for some people that was really helpful, the approach that we took. For others, it was like, oh my gosh, it's a bit uncomfortable. Because we were kind of looking at original context. We were looking at the fact that, maybe we can put those maps up, the fact that these stories evolved and developed in a culture very different from us. This is the sort of modern day area where these Bible stories developed. Okay, so we're talking about countries like Iraq and Syria and present-day Israel and Egypt. If we look at a more ancient map of this area, next map, we'll see, okay, so that's homing in on what's called the ancient Near East. So here's the Mediterranean Sea here. This is the land of Canaan. This is the area called Mesopotamia. It's called that because Meso, between, Mesopotamia rivers. We've got the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers there. We'll come back to those in a second because that's kind of significant, because those rivers flooded a lot, and that might give us a little bit of a clue as to where some of these flood stories come from. And then we've got Egypt down here. So some of the Hebrew stories in the Bible evolved in a more Mesopotamian context, some in a more Egyptian context, some in a more Canaanite context. We see those influences on the Hebrew Bible. They're just there. It's just like you can't, it's impossible really to tell the story of North America without talking about Native Americans, without talking about Northern Europeans and migrations, without talking about slavery, without talking about all kinds of things that have formed the culture that we have today. And like the stories that we have in our cultures are embedded in that past. And that's just the same for these Bible stories. So we've got to wrestle with them and struggle with them. Now, we looked last week at an ancient myth called the Enuma Elish, which is an ancient Mesopotamian creation myth. I'm writing that up now because it's the Enuma Elish. That's how you say it, pronounce it. And that just means when on high. It's the first words of that creation myth. And the Genesis account begins in a similar way, when God was creating, or when in the beginning God was creating. So the Hebrew creation story kind of is in dialogue in some sense with other prevailing stories in the culture at that time. And they're both kind of using those stories because that's what makes sense in that culture. That was their understanding, that was their reality. But also they're disagreeing with it, or they're in sort of polemic with it, if you like. They're contradicting it at times. And so what we have are stories in the Bible that very often are found in other cultures, but have a unique flavor, a unique sense to them. And we're going to look at a story today in a moment called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is perhaps a more well-known one of these ancient myths, which has a flood story in it, a very famous flood story. The Epic of Gilgamesh was like the classic of the ancient world. We'll talk about that, as I said, in a second. But the Bible stories differ in unique ways. And so we need to kind of look at these stories and think like, okay, in what way are they different? What are these writers in the Hebrew Bible telling us about their understanding of God, their understanding of reality? We last week, we kind of wrestled a little bit with the text, and we saw some unique aspects in that text, right? We saw, for instance, that in the creation stories in the Hebrew Bible, there's a demythologizing that goes on. In other words, the Hebrew understanding was not like the Mesopotamian or the Egyptian or the Canaanite understanding of the world, which was polytheistic. In other words, there's all kinds of gods and they're at war with each other and life is pretty chaotic and these gods don't really care particularly about humanity. Rather, the Hebrew view was that God is one. And they write their text in that way. So they're careful, for instance, not even to use certain words like sun and moon. They just talk about the light and the day and the light and the night, because they don't want to use the literal words for sun and moon, because those were also the names for the ancient sun deity and the moon deity. So they're telling us that the divine reality is whole, it's one. It's not this multiplicity of gods. It's one God, okay? And over time in Israel, monotheism evolved, obviously. One of the interesting things, on the seventh day of the first creation story, God pronounces it holy, right? God rests. And it's called the seventh day. The word Sabbath is never used there, because again, Sabbath is the Hebrew name and the Canaanite name for the god Saturn, which is where we get our term Saturday from. So even there's demythologizing there. But when God says that the seventh day is holy, what we talked about last week was how time is sacred. In the Hebrew worldview, time is sacred. In other words, God's not found in a mountain or a river or a volcano or something like that. God is in time, everywhere, all the time, and is in intimate connection with us, because there's this presence in our history, our story as time goes on. So whoever we are, our past, no matter what it's like, God is in that. God is in our present. God is in our future. That's the Hebrew unique worldview, very different to the prevailing ancient Near East views of the time. We saw that humanity has this high place in creation. In the ancient Mesopotamian myths, humanity was formed from the blood of dead gods and was formed to do the work of gods, actually. The gods they got kind of lazy and tired, so humanity was created so they didn't have to do all the work. Whereas in the Hebrew story, humanity is almost like the pinnacle of creation, created in the image of God, not to be a slave, but to be a partner with God in co-creating and even managing this beautiful creation that we live in. So these are the themes that are constantly being told to us through the ways the Hebrews told the story. And there's a really interesting point which we didn't get to really last week. But we have those two trees in the second creation story, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And there is another key Hebrew theme, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if you remember, we kind of talked about that in terms of consciousness, right? It's perhaps when they ate from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they suddenly understood all that is good and all that is evil. And we as human beings have this capacity, which seems unique to us on the planet, for the choice between doing really good things and really terrible things. And we've seen the whole gamut played out in human history, right? So that tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the key tree in that story. Really, the tree of life barely gets a mention. So in other words, the Hebrew, what I think we're being told by the Hebrew writers is morality. The choices we make and how we live, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is way more important than immortality, right? Living forever. The tree of life barely figures in the story, and in fact, right at the end, God removes the tree of life. But if you read these ancient stories from the ancient Near East, immortality is the goal of all humanity. They're constantly striving to become immortal. That's actually the main theme of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, this king from Uruk in Sumer, some 2,500 years BCE, is striving for immortality. And that's the goal. But the Hebrew worldview is how we live in this world, in this time, in this moment, the choices we make, and the connection we have to the divine. That's what's important, as opposed to living forever or some kind of immortality. So we have some unique and profound elements to these stories that if we just sort of take them literally or gloss over them, we would miss, I think. And the same is true, I think, of the flood story, right? So ever since humanity kind of woke up to this consciousness, I don't know when or how that happened, but at some point consciousness evolved, right? And we started thinking about, oh, we're alive, we're here, we're present, there's somebody over there, etc. And we're not just living based on instinct like most animals do, most other animals. We became aware of the universe around us, and we started to tell stories to try and explain the universe. I mean, we have a whole bunch of stories now that are very scientifically based to try and understand and explain the universe, right? And they're fantastic, they're phenomenal. But we just didn't have that kind of knowledge. We didn't have that kind of technology back then. So we're telling stories to explain rainbows and earthquakes and the rain. And so the understanding was, well, there's sort of this firmament up in the sky. We read that in the first creation story. There's this firmament, this kind of like this element up in the sky that keeps the waters above up there, and then keeps the waters below down here. And then when it rains, the sort of the sort of taps turn on in the firmament, or there's holes in the firmament that let the rain in. We know that's not true, right? We know that's not literally true. That was their way of understanding it, because we understand the water cycle, right? We understand that the cause of earthquakes. We understand the cause of rain. We understand the cause of storms. Back then, they viewed that as, many cultures viewed that as the gods. That was the gods, thunder gods and storm gods and volcano gods and earth gods and all that kind of thing. Those were what were causing these things to happen. And they told stories about those gods. And some of those stories were to do with things they saw in the sky, like the stars and that kind of thing. And that's how an understanding, a communal understanding of reality evolved for those ancient people. Now, before we we know that's not true, right? We found out more about the universe since then. But before we sort of jump to any sort of deep sense of arrogance. Let's remember that, especially as religious people, we've not always been great at accepting new truth from science, right? New truth and understanding from science. You think about people like Copernicus and Galileo and how they were treated when they started working out that maybe we're not the center of the universe, but maybe we're revolving around the sun rather than the sun revolving around us. So we need to take a sort of a pinch of salt, perhaps. Let's also remember that our understanding of the universe now has greatly benefited us, but we're also somewhat ignorant of things, right? Let me give you an example of this. So every culture, every ancient culture has flood stories, right? So that, I mean, if you go back, and pretty much every ancient culture all over the world, there are stories about some kind of cataclysmic flood that happened. And sometimes there's multiple stories and stories about multiple floods. And when we look at the archaeological evidence, there's lots of evidence to suggest there were destructive floods throughout human history. And it seems that the human world, human culture began writing stories and telling stories about these very significant events that happened in history. We can imagine heavy rains, and we've to some degree all probably experienced some flooding, right? I mean, on the whole, we find this ocean and rivers kind of nice, attractive, right, in our modern world. We have technology to buffer some of the aggression, if you like, of the oceans and the rivers, right? We go and have recreational time on rivers. We go to the beach. We maybe take cruise ships to sail around the world. Some people are fortunate enough to do that. But the ancients were terrified of water. They were terrified of the oceans because they would have to go out and fish on the high seas and drown. They were victims of flooding, tsunamis. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers notoriously flooded somewhat chaotically and unpredictably regularly and caused all sorts of destruction. We also know that 10 to 8,000 years ago, the huge northern polar ice cap, the one that covered pretty much the whole of North America and was up to 4 kilometers deep at some points, began to melt, or it was coming to the end of its melt. And around about 8,000 years ago, sea level was raised by about 1.4 meters. Right, we know that from looking at the records scientifically. And we know that caused mass flooding and mass destruction, which wasn't all negative because it caused people to move away from some of the coastlines, and farming was spread, farming techniques were spread around the world, and pottery and different things. And anthropologists look at this as a sort of a major force in the spread of humanity into the more interior parts of land masses. But it's not hard to imagine that there must have been significant flooding going on then, and very disruptive flooding. So people began telling stories about this because it's there, it's seared into the collective memory. They didn't understand that, the polar ice caps are melting. That must be what it is. We're coming to the end of an ice age. Their understanding was the gods are angry, or the gods are at war with one another, and that many of the stories are told that way. And again, so my point being, okay, so that's what we might think of as a somewhat ignorant understanding of the world, right? There was not as much knowledge back then. However, think about this for a moment, and perhaps we can carry this into the story with a touch of humility. We know we're melting the ice caps, right? We understand it. We get it. We've got all the data. We don't need any more proof, any more evidence. And we're still doing nothing about it, right? Or relatively little. Okay, so when you think about the human race and our capacity now versus the capacity for understanding back then, I'm not sure that we're actually any more advanced. I mean, I think we need to be somewhat humble about it, right? And we'll come back to that point towards the end, because I think that's a significant takeaway from us as we look at these stories. Now, as I mentioned, there's a flood story contained in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh. I asked last week, by the way, has anybody ever read the Enuma Elish? And my wife just laughed at me afterwards because she said, "Why would anybody read the Enuma Elish? You're a MA. Has anybody ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh?" That's a bit more. Yeah, we've got some. Okay, fantastic. I think we've got another slide of it. Fantastic story. I'm not. It's a good story. It's a really great story. It's about this guy Gilgamesh, who's this king, and he It's written, I mean, thousands of years ago, right? We think in the form we have it now, it was probably put together around about 1800 BCE, so nearly 4,000 years ago. It's about Gilgamesh, this king, who's a real rambunctious, kind of arrogant king, very powerful. He's 2/3 God. So, I mean, genetically, but it doesn't kind of work out, right? But that's how ancients told the stories, right? So he's 2/3 God, and so the gods they decide they're going to deal with Gilgamesh, and they create out of clay this human-like being. And there's some parallels here to the second story in the Genesis account of creation, called Enkidu, and he's this kind of wild beast human figure, and Gilgamesh ends up fighting him, but they end up becoming the best of friends, and there's this beautiful connection, this beautiful relationship that they have. But then Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is heartbroken, and he's the most powerful guy on the planet, but he can't stop people dying. And he goes on this quest for immortality, right? I was mentioning that earlier. So that's what the Epic of Gilgamesh is. It's this stirring, moving story. I mean, stories like this, myths like this, have the capacity to address issues that are profound when you're not bound by having to tell things exactly detailed the way they all happened, or where they don't have to all obey all the rational rules of the universe, right? So for instance, if I was to tell you about the last hour of my life, or the first hour of my morning this morning, literally it would be pretty boring. But we tell stories like, Avengers Infinity War or Endgame, or we tell stories like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or the Epic of Gilgamesh or whatever, the Iliad. These stories that kind of contain really deep truths that move us and stir us, that we know are true, right? We all long for immortality. We all miss people. We all grieve over the fact that we only have a moment of it on this planet, right? So these stories are they get to us in a way that, in a unique kind of way. So in this story was sort of recovered towards the end of the 19th century. So there's this heroic figure. I think we got a picture of him. That's George Smith, right? What a great name, George Smith. He was a volunteer worker at the British Museum. And the British, being an imperial power, had this habit of going to other countries like Iraq or modern-day Iraq and sort of doing archaeological excavations and finding all these treasures and then bringing them back to our country and saying they're ours now. That's what we did. So in the British Museum, you can see some of the tablets on which the Epic of Gilgamesh was made, because they were discovered in Mosul, current-day Mosul, Iraq, and brought back. And this is tablet 11, right? It's called the Flood tablet. Now, when you think about tablets, we think about the Ten Commandments and Moses coming down the mountain with these massive, great tablets, and they're really impressive. Actually, if you go to the British Museum, that tablet's about that big. It'll be a little bit like Moses coming down with a couple of iPhones or something. So they're just not quite as dramatic. It's coming. So they're not huge, but they were sort of. We've got cuneiform writing on there, which is little wedges. It was an ancient. The language is Akkadian. But anyway, that guy George Smith, he got hold of this tablet 11. He had other tablets too, and he started translating it, and he realized that it tells a story that is remarkably similar to the story of Noah. And we know the story of Noah. Like we're going to look at one or two aspects of the story of Noah. But it's a story about God destroying the world through a flood, but choosing Noah's family because Noah was good. God was sad with the world because it was so evil, but Noah was good, so Noah's saved. All the animals go on the ark, and then the flood comes. Everybody's wiped out, and then the flood recedes. And Noah kind of starts off the human race again, right? That's the basic story of Noah. Very similar story on tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And what happens is Gilgamesh, in his search for eternal life, discovers that there is one person on the planet who has eternal life. He's a guy called Utnapishtim, and he finds Utnapishtim, and basically Utnapishtim says, I'm the only one who's going to be immortal. You're not going to get it. But he tells him how he became immortal, and he became immortal through a flood. God sent a flood, but chose Utnapishtim to survive and gave him immortality. That's a difference to the biblical story, because Noah was not immortal, right? But that's how Utnapishtim became immortal. So that's the sort of thread of that story. But the flood story told there is remarkably similar to the Noah flood. And so scholars have worked out that really the Noah story, which came after this story, less ancient than this story, and the Hebrew people were a minority, right? So this was the prevailing story. So the Hebrew story kind of evolved in that context. So in some sense, the Hebrews, when they write this story, when they write this flood story, they're kind of, in one sense, stuck with it. Do you know what I mean? They can't just totally write a brand new story, because they've grown up in this culture, they've evolved in this culture where there's a prevailing story about this flood that happened. And if you don't have a flood story, well, you're not telling your history, because we all know that this ancient stories of floods, right? So to some degree, we have this story, and that they're bound to tell a story like this. What's key is, what is the unique aspect to this story, right? What is the unique aspect? What are they saying to us in this story that is different to the story that is told by Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh? Now, what's similar, we don't need to look at, I'm not going to read all these things out, but what's similar are many aspects to the story, okay? So the things like the building materials, how the ark was populated with the animals, the descriptions of the waves, the birds that get sent out to check for when Noah sends out birds to check whether the flood has receded or not, and then coming off the ark and the sacrifices that are made, they are all sort of parallel in those two stories, and in the same order, even when order could have diversified, where it could have gone off here, could have gone off there. They could have changed the plot a little bit. So there's direct correlation. This last point here, the final release and sacrifices. So Noah comes off the ark and sacrifices. There's a burnt offering that goes up to God, and it says that God smelled the sweet odor of the sacrifices. That is the only reference in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, to God smelling anything. Right? That's very anthropomorphic language that doesn't tend to be used. That sense is not used in describing God. But it's there in the original text of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because the gods, who are dependent for food on the sacrifices of humans, are starving by the end of the flood. They caused the flood, but they are starving because there's nobody around to make sacrifices. So when they smell the first sacrifice for 40 days and 40 nights, they're like, oh, that's beautiful. And we get that sort of bleeding through into the Hebrew text as well, somewhat unusually. So just lots of parallels, lots of similarities. Now, let's just look at some aspects of the Noah story, and we're going to kind of pull out some of the unique aspects. So we're not going to look at the whole story. We're just going to look at some of them. So let's just look at, we're going to look at several scriptures here. So this is at the beginning. The flood story is Genesis 6 to Genesis 9. It's 4 chapters. I would encourage you to read it. There are discussion questions available online and outside that sort of, assume you have read the whole story, so you can kind of look at it and interpret some things for yourself. We're just going to take some snippets here. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them that they chose. So there's a bit of unusual mythology here, right? The sons of God saw that the daughters of human were beautiful, and they married any of them. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim, so they're giants. Okay, that word Nephilim in the Hebrew means giant. So these giants were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, up until this point in the Bible, we've heard lots of, in chapters 4 and 5, we've heard lots of mythological stories, lots of stories about people living for thousands or hundreds of years, and about some horrible murders, and sort of life has gone in a wrong direction, right? Evil, if we think about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, evil seems to be prevailing over good. And this text here, which is the beginning of the story of Noah, seems to be suggesting that there's some kind of mythological association with that. We've got like the sons of God, some kind of godlike beings mating with humans and producing giants, and they're kind of these sort of heroic, or that doesn't necessarily mean good, but there's these ancient stories about their activities which we apparently have lost but would have probably been familiar to those original leaders. It's kind of mythological language, and it seems to be conjuring up for us this sort of decline of humanity. And that continues on into the next section. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Okay, so there's some hyperbole here, right? The great wickedness, that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Okay, so now let's think about this for a second. Do you think at any point in human history, humans have only been completely evil with no good whatsoever? Right? Probably not. Okay, so this is, I think, another key to us, that this is a story that's being told. This is hyperbolic language, extreme language, to paint a vivid, extreme picture. I mean, if we were to impose our own modern sensibilities on this, for instance, we'd probably say that if God... God's angry, right? Upset. If God went to see a cosmic therapist, the therapist would say, well, first of all, use me statements, so the world is making me feel angry and sad and that kind of thing, right? And also, don't say all and every time and always. And do you know what I mean? That's we know that that's not very healthy, right? So that's our modern sensibilities. But this is a story being told to us to set the scene in extreme ways. The Lord regretted, that's a very graphic word in the original Hebrew. He regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, so there's one person who seems to be good, right? Let's move on. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. Okay, so that word blameless, actually, in the original Hebrew, it can be translated perfect. I'm not sure. I mean, do we really think Noah was perfect? Probably not. He's a type, right? That's extreme language. I mean, Noah, in fact, when you read this story, and there's a question about this in the discussion questions, how do you relate to Noah? I'll tell you how I relate to Noah. It's hard to relate to Noah. He really doesn't say anything till right at the end of the story. He acts a little bit robotic-like. God says do this, and he does it. There's not a lot of, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of maneuvering with Noah. Interestingly, he doesn't, think about this. If God told you, or anybody told you, I'm going to wipe out the whole earth because everybody sucks, basically. Would you just go, okay, sure, what do you want me to do? You would expect at least, really? I mean, come on, there's Jeff down the road, he's not that bad, and there's that guy, and you would, even every one of us would kind of plead, but just like Abraham did when God said God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So, but we don't get any of that with Noah. There's no empathy really with Noah. So again, it's almost like he's just in the plot to drive this flood story forward for us. But he's good. He's described as good, in fact, perfect. He walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. Again, hyperbolic language. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Now, so make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. Right? And then there's a whole story that corresponds very much to the Epic of Gilgamesh. A couple of thoughts about this piece here. Did you notice in the first passage it said the Lord said this, the Lord was this, the Lord was that. And then in this one it's saying God said this and God felt this. And that's a change in the language there between Yahweh, the name for God Yahweh, which is translated Lord in the English Bible, and Elohim, which is translated God in the English Bible. So there's different words for God there, and it seems, just like with the two creation accounts, it seems that this story has kind of been compiled probably from different versions, different traditions within the Hebrew tradition, to what we call redacted, edited, put together from different traditions. And that might explain when you read the story, there will be some contradictions and some repetitions. Okay, so when you read it from chapters 6 to 9, it doesn't read all that smoothly because there are parts repeated and the parts that seem to contradict each other. Like, for instance, how many animals of each species did Noah take on the ark? 2, right? But there's other verses that say it was 7. Some species, and it seems like the species that were later viewed as clean species in Hebrew law are taken on in 7 of them at a time. So there's some sort of parts where it seems contradictory, and so this, again, understanding this story was probably put together from different traditions. That's why we see some of these contradictions. It doesn't mean we should just throw it out because it's self-contradictory. Let's move on a little bit. So we've got this destruction thing going on. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, very specific, on that day all the springs of the deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now what we see here is, of course, the water from above and the water from below coming together again. It's like the reverse. It's like an uncreation of the reversal of the first creation story, where God separated the waters and brought order out of chaos. So this is like an inevitable uncreation. It's almost like this is violence and evil. And let's remember, actually, that the violence that is described is not violence against God. It's not like people saying, oh, we're not going to worship you, we're going to worship this. Or it's not personal against God. It's how humans are treating one another. That's what's grieving God. And it's like humans kind of bringing on this chaos, you could interpret this perhaps as humanity getting what it's asking for, okay? The story's written like it's a judgment from God, but there's an inevitability to our destructive behavior, right? I mean, there's consequences to our destructive behavior. And it's like an invitation to chaos. It's as we make evil choices over good choices, we're saying yes to, let's go back to chaos. Let's go back to the chaos of the deep that we talked about last week. And so the water above and the water below is coming back together again. Now, significantly though, in a little bit later, it says this: but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heaven have been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The Spirit of God, in the Hebrew, the ruach, the Spirit of God, or actually literally translated, the wind. The wind was blowing over the deep, and that's what caused this order out of chaos. That's what caused this separation. So we have a return to chaos, but then there's a new creation going on here, because the wind is back, the Spirit of God is back, separating out these waters and restoring order, overcoming chaos, overcoming evil. Now, then God blessed Noah and his sons, so they come off the ark. There's all the thing with the birds and the rest. So you can read all about that. They come to rest on a mountaintop. The birds go out, and then they come off the ark. And God says to Noah and his sons, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the earth." That rings a bell, right? Genesis 1:28. Go forth and multiply, if you like. That was the original intention of the first creation story, right? That humanity would prosper and fill the earth. And so this is a new creation. This is a new beginning. It has a lot of reference back to those original stories. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and all the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth." So here's another big difference. This is a massive difference to all the other flood stories, right? God says, I will establish a covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. Right? So there's this story culminates in a promise. It culminates in what's called a covenant. In terms of the theology of this, it's called the Noahide covenant, right? So it's, God's covenant, God's commitment to humanity. This is a unique aspect, and that covenant is kind of sealed with a sign. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Is there a little bit more there, or I think we've finished there? Is that it? Yeah. So we finish, so the story finishes with this rainbow. There's a bit more that happens. Like probably, again, Noah, one of the first things he does, new creation, he's just been saved from the flood. He plants a vineyard, makes some wine, and gets drunk. I mean, so you make what you want of Noah. Okay, so there's more to the story, but really it culminates in this amazing commitment that God makes to humanity. Now we've got a number of things going on here, right? And so just to sort of wrap up, I want to try and pull out, well, so what? So there's ancient flood stories. This is another one of them. There are some unique aspects to this. So what's the point of all this? Firstly, I think there are really two major differences, two vitally important major differences. One is morality. The issue of morality in the story, and the other is the issue of covenant, of God making a commitment to humanity, and what that says about the way the Hebrews viewed life, the way the Hebrews viewed God, the way the Hebrews experienced divine life. This issue of morality, we talked about that at the beginning, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil versus the tree of life. This issue of morality means for us that what we do matters. And in this story, God is not just sort of, I'm fed up with the earth, they're annoying me. There's a reason for it. It's because of all the violence. It's because of all the destruction. It's because of all the evil. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's very capricious. The gods, some of the versions of the stories suggest that the gods felt human beings were too noisy and irritating. But there's no morality to it. They're not like, there should be justice, this is wrong. They're very fickle. And that was the nature, the unpredictable nature of the ancients, or the gods in the ancient world. But here we have morality. We have the fact that God is acting based on injustice and violence amongst humanity. And Noah is chosen because he is righteous. Utnapishtim, the figure in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the flood story, the guy who gains immortality, he's chosen very randomly. It's not because he's a good person in particular. So what we're reading in this story, or the way the Hebrews are telling this story, is they're kind of, if you like, they're stuck with the destruction of the world through a flood, right? And in their worldview, they're sort of stuck with, well, God's behind all that, our different kind of God, but it's still behind all that. But what we see is a different reason for it and a different philosophical view of it. Morality, how we live is really important. Now, that still poses us a bit of a problem, right? Because we're talking genocide here. And there's a challenge. Let me suggest a couple of ways we might approach that challenge, and then a challenge that we might absorb ourselves in that story. Firstly, this. As I said, perhaps we should focus more on what's unique in this story, namely the anger at injustice, the grief at injustice, the grief at violence, and what that says about God, rather than the embedded aspect of the destruction of the earth. Okay, like I said, the destruction of the earth through a flood is kind of embedded in this story. There's not much they can do about that. But we should perhaps focus on what's unique. And secondly, well, perhaps there's two aspects to this as well. Let's think about, if we are angry at God destroying the world, how angry are we about the fact that we're destroying the world? I mean, is there, to the modern here, to a modern person, is there perhaps some hypocrisy in our accusations to this divine being destroying the earth, when does it actually expose the fact that we're either ignorant or apathetic or we're just blind to the fact that we might be destroying the planet ourselves? Sea levels are going up, the planet's warming. I mean, we're facing catastrophe, but are we anywhere near as angry about it? Does it generate that same kind of emotion? I think that's a challenge we can take away from this story. And then secondly, on that score, do we want an angry God or not? I mean, do we want to think about, in the sort of moral sense of the universe, well, what you do doesn't really matter. I mean, yeah, violence, war, destruction of the planet, don't worry, it's fine. Nobody really cares about that too much. Or do we want a sense of, no, this is wrong. There should be grief, a sense of anger, a sense of loss. And of course, this is played out in the prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible, where there's some angry language about injustice, the way we treat one another, violence, power against powerlessness. What sort of reality do we want? And there's some discomfort clearly in the pathos of this story. But should we be that uncomfortable with it? I guess is one kind of question. The other thing, so that's all to do with morality, right? There's a moral theme to the story. The second unique aspect to this is the covenant, as I said, this commitment of God to humanity. This is unlike anything in the ancient Near East. The gods didn't really care about humanity. They were slaves. They were to be put to work by the gods. They served the gods' purposes. This is God saying, okay, I'm making a commitment to you. It seems that God's regret for destroying the earth outweighs the regret he had for creating it in the first place, right? There's a regret at the beginning and then there's regret at the end. And that term rainbow, the rainbow is the key sort of image here that we're left with in this story. That term for the rainbow, in the Hebrew it's kesheth, right? Kesheth is the Hebrew word for it. It just means bow. It's translated rainbow here because it's clear that it's a rainbow, it's a bow in the sky after it's been raining. But what it means is war bow. It's the bow like as in bow and arrow. So it's as though God is setting this bow aside in the sky. Perhaps the prevailing meaning of this story, perhaps, and this is my view, I'm not alone in having this view, but it's certainly not the prevailing view. But perhaps the reason behind this story and the way it's told is to say that God is doing away with redemptive violence. In other words, the violent actions of the gods, or in this case, the Hebrew whole God, the returning violence with violence, punishing violence with more violence, it's like that clearly doesn't work, okay? It doesn't work here because there's a new creation. Noah goes off and gets drunk. His sons kind of lose the plot. We end up with the Tower of Babel and more chaos ensuing, and et cetera, et cetera. Redemptive violence, as you read the whole story, does not work, and it's as though God is saying, I'm not going to do it. It's like, and I think we should question whether God ever did violence in the first place, but in the way that it's understood by the ancients, this is God doing away with violence, setting aside the weapons of war, putting a bow in the sky, and every time that rainbow appears, it's like a symbol of non-violence. It's a symbol of forgiveness and of acceptance of peace, not animosity. And this is unique in the ancient world, this Hebrew concept that God would make that kind of commitment, that God cares, that God is present intimately in our time, in our lives, and is committed to us, is in our story. That's a unique view of God. So I think those are the things that we can take away from this story. And I would really encourage you to get a copy of those discussion questions. If you're in a group, have those discussions, wrestle with them. If you're not, just have a talk with somebody, somebody else. So take a moment and sort of wrestle with the implications of this story, because I think they are deeply challenging to us. Not only our view of God, but also how do we want to behave, and what responsibility do we have on the earth? What responsibility do we have when it comes to the violent, consumerist, greedy actions of humanity, of which I am a part, of which I dare say we all are a part, and the consequences of those actions, and the sort of sense of hyperbole, perhaps, that we need to embrace as we rethink that story and think about our own planet and our own lives now. A sense of urgency, perhaps, a sense of vitality and importance of this story to us in the present day. So let's just pray, and then we're going to sing a song to close. But I do encourage you to keep thinking about this story, and then come back next week. We're going to jump ahead into the book of Exodus. Ruth is going to talk about the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the fact that we have the privilege of reading these ancient stories, when for much of history they were lost or in a language that very few people could understand. So thank you for the creativity in humanity, that we can tell stories and think imaginatively about you and about creation. Lord, just bring the reality of this story, however we interpret it, bring this home to us in a way that we can respond practically in our connection to you, in our understanding of our oneness with you, and in our understanding of our connection to creation, our connection to one another, our connection to the planet. Lord, may we seek justice, and Lord, may your kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand and sing together.